Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Trebor Scholz in today's episode. Trebor is the author of Overworked and Underpaid: How Workers Are Disrupting the Digital Economy, and editor of multiple books such as Hours to Hack and to Own, Platform-Cooperativism, A New Vision for the Future of Work and a Fairer Internet. He is professor at the New School in New York and founding director of the Platform-Cooperativism Consortium and the Institute for the Cooperative Digital Economy, both of them at the New School as well. In general, Trebor is highly involved in the platform cooperativism movement, which will be at the center of our conversation today. Before we start, I would like to thank Bernhard, Wilfried and Fabian for their kind donations, and I would like to welcome Anna as a Patreon of Future Histories. Thank you so much for your support. If you as well would like to support Future Histories, then please do so. This could be, as you just heard, through a donation or monthly support on Patreon, but it also could be in the form of simply telling a friend about the show or sharing the content through your favorite channels of sharing content. So thank you very much. It's highly appreciated. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Trebor Scholz on platform cooperativism. Welcome, Trebor.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Trebor, let's start with the definition. What is a platform cooperative?
Right. So I guess this is a sort of a three-part question, right? So people need to understand what cooperatives are in the first place. So here, this is I'm mostly focusing on two types of cooperatives. There are many more. Mostly interested in worker cooperatives, where the company is owned by the workers that all have an equal say in its operation. So it's based on the principle of one worker, one vote. And so it's democratic ownership, right? And then the second type of cooperative that I think is most relevant to the digital economy and a good example of a platform cooperative is multi-stakeholder cooperative. So this means that you don't have this wall around a small number of members who all benefit from this cooperative form, right? By having higher wages or by having a secure place to work and by having a voice in the workplace, which is really quite rare when you think about it globally and when you think about how this idea of participatory democracy has propagated across countries, right? So who claim this concept, right, as something that is very central to their aspiration. But in the workplace, where most people spend most of their day, that is quite absent, right, in most workplaces. So quite fascinating. So that's cooperatives. So with a focus on multi-stakeholder cooperatives and worker co-ops, multi-stakeholder cooperatives, including also people from the community that are so not just a small number of the members, but it can also have classes within the cooperative that are in the community that are other than the workers, So and that breaks with this idea that cooperatives can only benefit a small number of members. And there are, tens of thousands of examples of that in Italy with social cooperatives and, really all over the world. Yeah. So that's a cooperative. Then a platform cooperative is really like a digital platform. Now we also think about, Web3, with protocols and other technologies. But company for whom the digital operation is central, number one. So it's not Genossenschaft or a cooperative with a website or so, right? So like really where that's at the heart of their operation as a business. And they follow the cooperative principles that were, designed by the International Cooperative Alliance. So essentially those, two characteristics.
And could you give us an example of a platform cooperative, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a wonderful project in Europe. It's called SMART, which is in 9 European countries, and it's focused on freelancers. And it's makes this very interesting move of building on this sort of legal hack, you might call it, to transform freelancers, so to speak, into employees. So that means basically they give freelancers employee status by making them employees of the cooperative, and thereby affording them all the benefit under labor law that are significant. In some countries, not so significant in others, so it really depends. But including things like unemployment, right? And, labor law is in most countries designed mostly for employees and not for freelancers. So freelancers are not protected, right? And this move to make them employees essentially grants them that right. So that's smart. They're doing that specific to each country, like so in Italy and Spain and Germany, mostly in Belgium. That's where most members are, and also in France. And they have 35,000 members. They, wrote over 100,000 contracts and have like a revenue of 200 million euros a year. So quite a significant operation. They have co-working spaces for freelancers. And so they are, let's say, an opera singer, and you get engaged by like an opera house or so. You basically, the co-op, the platform co-op, acts as your employer, and the opera house essentially interacts with the co-op, not with the freelancer. So the money then goes to SMART, and SMART pays the freelancer a salary. So this has the advantage that often freelancers suffer from not being paid on time, and in SMART's case, they pay 7 days after the work is performed, no matter if that organization has paid or not. So, and as SMART is quite significantly large, nobody really dares to not pay because they would be added to a blacklist, right? Which then no freelancer would work with them. So it takes the anxiety out of freelancing too.
Interesting model. And when you were talking about the definition of platform cooperatives, you mentioned multi-stakeholder cooperatives, and you said that there are different, you said, classes within the multi-stakeholder cooperative. What is the kind of representation that these classes are involved with? Because, I mean, this might be a form of ownership, a part of ownership, or it might be something different, like really taking part within the structures that form the given cooperative. So are there different models of representation as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one platform co-op that is in the process of converting from an Italian worker co-op of tech workers to a multi-stakeholder platform co-op is Fairbnb, which, as the name suggests, right, offers short-term rental, and 50% of the revenues go to local communities. So for projects that the community can decide on, such as whatever, building a playground or, whatever the community wants. So that so that the money, the revenue that is generated is not simply going to Silicon Valley, right, as it does with the competitor, but stays in that community. So the way they are doing this is quite obvious, right? So this is where the hosts, of course, would be a class, right? And then potentially the guests as well. And then what you point to is a complicated question, which is really not so easy to answer because it really differs from co-op to co-op. So like how, there are, for example, also non-voting classes, right? So that you have actually, stakeholders that, they are, let's say, really involved with the company, but they don't have voting rights, right? That also exists. So it's complicated. I can't really generalize on that, but it gives you the way to, but everybody is still part of it, right? So in like a wonderful example of this is also in the Italian mountain ranges, like in so many countries in the rural areas, right? So there are many small towns that have a significant retention problem, right? So people are leaving, and so it makes it very hard for the people that stay, that are left behind, to still operate, let's say, the restaurant, the cinema, the hotel, etc. And so they form cooperatives, right? They form one cooperative, like a community cooperative that does everything. So the same person might work as part of this cooperative in a restaurant in the afternoon or in the evening, might be a shepherd in the morning, and maybe work in the post office at lunch or so, So essentially, and this is important, right? Cooperatives always emerged in moments of crisis, right? So they emerge when, like, the government or markets fail, or even in the global south, support networks of families fail. Then you have, people turn to each other and found cooperatives. In the United States in the 1930s, a significant part of rural America was not electrified because the big utility companies didn't find it lucrative enough to electrify this last village in Montana, right? Just didn't pay, right? And so, with the help of President Roosevelt at the time, who wrote legislation making that easier, people in those rural areas got together and founded rural electric cooperatives. And this is how over 40% of the electric grid in the United States today is cooperative. Right? So essentially, like, there was a problem, and the market, right, wasn't interested to solve this problem. And so people had to take it on themselves. And this is very important to understand, because that is a very different framing than creating a tech startup to dominate the world and, extract from communities worldwide and outcompete the competition and be like that, let's say, like one startup that dominates the sector. It's a totally different way of thinking, right? So that's not why they ever emerged.
And one thing is to have one cooperative, but what you are working on goes beyond that, because what you're involved in and what you kind of co-founded, I guess, is a form of movement. So platform-cooperativism is a form of movement, and I would be interested in what is the state of things when it comes to platform cooperativism as a movement, and specifically going into the question of how do you succeed in networking the different cooperatives with each other, and therefore kind of creating some form of, I don't know a better word, but synergy effect, or something that goes beyond what one cooperative might be able to do, and create something that points towards maybe even an alternative form of political economy as such?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful questions. So it's I think the big vision for this work is really pluralist cooperative commonwealth. And so I think what you point out is essential because it's so we are working with over 500 businesses, and there are many more. That's the one we are aware of in 62 countries. And so there are tens of thousands of people involved. It's truly global. There are definitely challenges and which have to do with startup funding, right? So like because the venture capitalist model banks on, investing, let's say, in, like for a venture capitalist to invest in 10 projects and 7 of them failing, 2 of them succeeding moderately, and 1 having this like windfall of money. So profit, which will just never be the case with cooperatives because that's just not, that's just against the principles. And so just with like these other projects that I described earlier, it's a community, right, that sees that having this business, creating this business, solves a problem that nobody else is willing to solve for them, right? So like these social cooperatives in Italy that I mentioned earlier when I talked about multi-stakeholder cooperatives, I think there are 11,000 of them. Much of that emerged after 2008 when Italy significantly reduced its budget for social care. So there are lots of cooperatives that emerged to help people with disabilities to have jobs, elder care, etc. So yeah, so but to come, so basically people see that there's a need and they put their money together. So it's crowd equity, right? So now there are also experiments like in New York City where a Lyft competitor, a taxi platform co-op called Drivers Cooperative, has over 4,000 drivers. And they have taken a significant amount of investor funding, traditional investors who want to see profit, but they did not give them controlling interest, right? So they can contribute, but they will not control the business, right? And that's what really matters with cooperatives, right? I mean, you can take this money, maybe even from a municipality. So I think there are thoughts in that direction as well. Like, why couldn't I don't know, the city of Hamburg or others be a class in one of those cooperatives? Now, this is quite controversial for people with a sort of co-op dogma. They would not agree to that. But I think it's interesting. As long as there's no controlling interest, I think it would be wonderful if municipalities get involved, right? So we are working with municipalities because you ask of the state of things. We're particularly interested in municipalities where this is really supported, right? So obviously the regulatory framework is really important for this to thrive. And it just happens that this is particularly the case in Emilia-Romagna in Italy. So the area around Bologna, which some people frame as Co-op Valley, right? So the sort of antidote to Silicon Valley. And with platform co-ops like Consegni e Teacher, but also Fairbnb and others. But then also Kerala in the south of India, which is a very progressive state, which has added platform co-ops to their government directive, which means that we will help them, my organization will help them, my institute will help them to implement some 4,000 platform co-ops in the next 5 years. At least that's their goal. And then there's California, and also now there's work in Buenos Aires, so like on Argentina more broadly. And then there's a lot going on in Brazil as well, like so Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, the states of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. So these are sort of the highlights, right? But it's also the Netherlands and Finland are of course also very open to this work. states, countries like Kenya have, I think 48% of the GDP in Kenya is cooperative. So it's significantly a cooperative culture. There is an organization, like a sister organization of the Platform Coop Consortium, now also in Berlin, in Germany, and the Platform Coops Germany, it's called. And there's now also, there's a Platform Coop Consortium in Hong Kong. There's just one starting now in Indonesia, in Java. So it's sort of in many, many different places. And I think right now, I think people are really interested, and I taught a course on this just a few weeks ago, on this overlap with Web3 technologies. So how can DAOs, right, distributed autonomous organizations, inform platform co-ops in terms of their governance, perhaps? And I think many people in that space, many technologists in that space, mistake what they are doing for cooperatives. Often not so clear on what a cooperative actually is. But that sort of helps a little bit because people get more interested and open, and also thinking about how one could organize data cooperatively. So how could you have cooperative data trusts? So this is essentially like a group of people creating a small pool of data and then giving like fiduciary rights over those data to the cooperative or some other entity. So these are all like experiments, right? Like this is just starting. But that's sort of the state of things. We had some small successes, let's say, with policymakers. Andrea Nahles made, when she was the leader of the Social Democrats, added platform co-ops to the, part of the vision of the SPD. But her candidacy wasn't, or her leadership wasn't exactly thriving, was it? But but nevertheless, she did that, and so we tried to pick up on that. The Labour Party under Corbyn and also under the current leadership still has it as their vision for the internet. As Platform Corps is one of their 10 guiding posts for that. So stuff going on the policy level. We have an institute at the New School, the Institute for the Cooperative Digital Economy, which has like a fellowship program. So we are just about to announce our new cohort, which will essentially research exactly what I just talked about. So like all of these little points I had, this is what they all tell.
And I guess one very interesting topic for further research would be the question of governance, because this is something I'm really interested in, because I mean, it's pretty easy to imagine like smaller scale structures of cooperatives where people are really involved in the governance of the given cooperative. But the more things get scaled up and the bigger the organization gets, the more difficult it becomes to imagine like meaningfully taking part within the governance structure and the self-governance of the whole thing. So are there experiments with like large-scale self-governed platform cooperatives, and what are the takeaways of these large-scale platform cooperatives? Because I imagine you run into very different problems once things get bigger.
Well, it's not just a question of governance, but it's also a question of scaling, right? And so how do we think of scaling? And it's really important to detach yourself from the I guess, Silicon Valley thinking, because co-ops scale very differently. So they scale worldwide through federations and alliances and collaborations. So in a way that is drastically different to anything coming out of Silicon Valley. So the traditional platform co-op as you may say, is an umbrella, right? An umbrella of many small cooperatives. So let's take, for example, and I gave that example in my TED Talk if you want to hear this a bit more in detail about this cleaning cooperative in New York. And it's essentially 3 very small worker co-ops, and they sit under this umbrella of this second level cooperative, the platform co-op. That's its own entity. And each of the 3 groups has a representative to the board of the platform co-op. So, and then this is how they all decide then how this platform co-op is operated, which really functions more as a labor supply for them, right? So it allows them access to jobs, better jobs, better gigs than they would have gotten than when they would have pinned a flyer to a tree, right? So they reach more affluent clients that can pay them more. And then this is something we haven't mentioned yet, allows them to make twice as much as they used to make before. So this is often the case with worker platform co-ops in that way. They, in care and in cleaning, right? They make twice as much. Okay, so how do they scale? Like this sort of federation is one model of scaling, and it allows them to still retain this interpersonal trust and friendships that are so important to cooperatives. No? So they are much more resilient than other business forms. Which is the research shows that after 2008, like there were far fewer cooperatives that went bankrupt than other businesses. And, it's not that they have any magic sauce or anything. It's just that they suck it up, right? So they stick together and they want this business to succeed because, and you could say this a bit more pompously, because they have a purpose, right? I mean, it's not about business. It's not about profit, right? It's about purpose, and so this is also what you see with other groups in India. For example, we work with the Seva Federation, and that Seva is a federation of cooperatives and a union. So the union has over 1 million members, and the Co-op Federation has over 300,000 members. And well, that's another topic altogether, like how those 2 bodies interact, right? Like, why would you need a union and a co-op? Turns out to be a very good idea. But the point here is that this is also over 105 cooperatives in this federation of Seva, right? So, and together they, for example, with COVID, right, like coordinated their help efforts to, provide workers with money and food and, medical supplies like masks, etc., sanitizer, hand sanitizer. So that really makes sense. And another huge cooperative federation in India is Amul, which is, I think, the largest milk producer in the world. And it's 1.7 million milk producers, small milk producers, all networked in this federation. And so I mean, I can talk a lot about that. There's lots of examples in Italy as well that illustrate this well, where essentially, like most Italian businesses are very small, but then they federate to be able to compete with larger companies. Right? But with the Web3, right, you have like another thing coming, and I'm not sure I would call those cooperatives, but they are, I think it's an interesting thing to explore, and they could work in that direction, where through blockchain, you can split ownership across, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people, right? So I don't know if you followed this at all. In the United States, there was an attempt to buy the Constitution. So I think there are, I don't know how many copies, probably a dozen or so, which were printed, initially. And I think it was $40 million for one copy. And this online group that tried to purchase it, they raised 19 million, which, you know, is not 40 million, but they raised $90 million, right? I mean, that is incredible. And so then they set their next targets on buying a soccer team jointly, and then a vacation resort, like a spa in Florida, that they wanted to jointly buy. So I think nobody really knows. It's just, I think it has just something to do that you can do that with blockchain, right? What that would look like, and I think it's completely unresolved, how people would then vote. Let's say they managed to buy this resort, now what, right? I mean, so how do they run it? That would be a huge experiment. But I think to split, I think the really interesting question is, like, the research is really clear that, like, worker co-ops and to an extent multi-stakeholder co-ops are better businesses for people, right? I mean, that's, so, you know, like, it's, you know, more sustainable, it's better for the planet, it's there are better jobs, there's dignity in the workplace, you know, people are treated as human beings, but it's not, you know, obviously as large as corporations. And so, well, this would be an interesting way to scale as well, right? Through this type of, like, ownership fractals, if you want, you know. But like I said, there isn't really an example yet of where that is actually happening, but it's very promising, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I understand the interest, the initial interest. I'm highly skeptical, I have to say, because I mean, it still very much stays within a very particular paradigm of private ownership, and then is able more or less to spread this over a given asset, so to speak. But well, let's say it's always interesting to see experimentation, I guess. So you mentioned that platform cooperatives are the better businesses because they are very much oriented towards a humane setting within one works and gets paid and has social interactions and so forth and so on. So what I think is really great about platform cooperatives is that they offer a very concrete alternative in the here and now, and that they also, by doing that, represent some form of, let's say, building block for how transformations to post-capitalist futures might actually look like. So I really, really love that. But at the same time, it's important to ask and also to be aware of what exactly they are able to do, for what kind of things they might be a solution, and for what they might not be a solution. So what the boundaries of this concept are? I heard an interview with you in which you said that you are often asked whether platform cooperativism is an alternative to Uber, Google, Facebook, etc. And at least in this interview, you replied that this is the wrong question. And so I would like to frame it a little differently. And the question would then be, if you consider platform cooperatives as a solution for certain kinds of social problems, for which problems might they be a solution, and for which problems maybe not?
Right. I mean, if you want to run a platform or start a platform, and you have an interest in a social justice lens, or if that is your mission, if you're interested in social justice, right, then I think there isn't a question that that's really the model to go with, right? But, you know, obviously, like, that is really not the objective of most businesses. So, but if that is your objective, then I think that would be the form to pick. I agree with you. I don't think it's the answer to everything at all. I mean, it's not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet to anything. But it is very suitable to, like, picking up on the historical narrative of what they have responded to in the past. So when you think about like one of the fastest growing, largest areas of the economy that is really failing, that is care, right? Elder care. So we have in all countries all over the world like a explosive growth of people over age 80 and older, and there's a significant, millions of workers missing to fill those spots to care for them, and that is also true in Germany, and where it's also, I think, hundreds of thousands of workers missing in that industry. And the reason is that it's a low prestige and terribly paid job, right? And so with platform cooperatives organizing this cooperatively, and we see some examples of this actually in California, in Los Angeles, where platform co-op started by a union, by the way, has started to work with 2 hospitals, and they have been doing this for a very long time. They had a pilot in 2016 or so, like with 10 nurses. And now they are working on scaling this up to 2,000. And then the hope is within 2 years to 10,000 nurses. And to essentially offer care work flexibly through an app, while paying the nurses better than they would have been paid otherwise. So I think it's a care sector is one example where I think this is very much predestined to work very well. And then also we see, it seems sort of counterintuitive, but this model in New York is working, right? With this competitor to Lyft. Not so much to Uber, right? So this is also interesting. It's not so much in terms of scale also. It's tertiary, right? So it's like the 3rd biggest player in New York, and has a chance at that, but otherwise definitely for food couriers. So we see that in Berlin, and I think also in Vienna, but all over the world. There were, I think, 8 or so of those founded in Barcelona in the last year alone. So they're really emerging quickly. Not that they all stay around, right? This was specific to the pandemic, but there is a large federation already. It's called Co-op Cycle, coming out of Paris, which has more than 60 cooperatives under its wing of couriers, and provides them with digital infrastructure, right? So they offer them the software, and in return, they all abide to certain principles. For example, they are not allowed to use motorcycles. It has to be bicycles for ecological reasons. So that's where you see this can really work, but we see it emerging in all kinds of sectors. So it's very hard to say actually, because we see it with, there's My Cool Classroom, which has language teachers organizing through platform cooperatives, which is essentially language teachers all over the world and being members of that. We see it for designers. We see it for photographers with Stocksy. We are seeing it in many different sectors. But I think care and transportation, I think, are probably will be the most likely ones to succeed. Yeah. And, in some countries, for example, like in Brazil, one of the largest domains of the cooperative movement in Brazil is actually hospitals and doctors and nurses. And so I think this is really where that comes together as well.
And what do we have to do if we want to use this principle, this type of social organization, so to speak, platform cooperatives, as something that is the nucleus for going beyond itself? Because there is, of course, an inherent danger in the way that it might also, by being the go-to place in crisis, kind of letting the state like from the hook, which would be a problem as well, because I mean this is an obvious danger. So I would say we need to like work in tandem with other movements, with other like ideas for alternative ways of doing economy, doing social organization, and all of that, in order to make platform cooperativism something that like really is a building block of a post-capitalist future, maybe.
No, I absolutely agree. So, I mean, again, like another really great question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's essential to work with other movements and political movements. So I think, unions are a great place to start. And just in passing to mention like why that matters. I mean, for many reasons, very interesting to look at that in the Indian example, but just to stay in New York where, like when they started, when Eric Foreman and his colleagues started Drivers Cooperative, like one of the main problems for a startup like that is that they don't have marketing funds, right? So you can run, because so much is dependent on supply, right? Like you also need drivers, right, that are available. So if you aren't known, right, if people haven't heard about you, that's a real problem. So this is where the VC-backed companies spend, millions of dollars. So they didn't have that money. So, but by working with the union, which has contacts to hundreds of thousands of people, right? So they were able to reach out to lots of New Yorkers, right, to tell them about this. And well, it helped when the New York Times picked up on it as well. So that's, I guess, one answer to that question.
And if you think about like models of political economy that go beyond this notion of platform cooperativism, what are the frameworks that you think about? Because I mean, I recently read a bit more about Paracon, participatory economics. I will do an interview with Robin Hanel tomorrow, by the way. And they, when they describe the processes of transformation, they very much point towards cooperatives as a necessary and very much important, fruitful building block of this, like, of course, long-lasting phase of transformation, of transition into other types of political economy. So we already established that cooperatives essentially have to be an important element of that. But what do you think about if you think beyond that? Like, because at some point, cooperatives will have like overlived themselves.
No, I completely agree with that comment as well. But I wanted to say, just go for a second back to your previous question, because I think there's more to be said about this. So James Mahoon has just published this book, Platform Socialism, where he picks up exactly at this point. I think a very interesting and fruitful book, but I think very much from a European perspective, where what we saw basically in the United States and in Poland and in Hungary and in so many other countries is that people just realize that there's a reason that they lost trust in government, right? And that is in the United States, when you imagine a worker having entered the labor market in 1978, perhaps, all these promises, right? In 50 years, nothing has changed for that worker, right? Except that productivity increased significantly and wages stagnated since 1978, right? So like, if adjusted for inflation. So, I mean, how can you blame anyone that they would be disengaged from federal government, right? So now I would not, I mean, it's just a fact. Do I like that? Of course not, right? And do I think that participatory democracy is a project that nobody should ever give up on? And electoral politics, of course, not, right? But then there's also the reality that those systems are just deeply broken, right? So you see this even with the current presidency to an extent, right? And so this is, I think, where municipalities become much more important, right? And because on that level, you can, it's limited what you can do, which we saw in the case of Barcelona, but you can do something and can actually really support a model like that to an extent and make changes to an extent, right? So I want to be really careful about this because I think I agree with you completely, and I don't want to say, I fully want to support what you said about, like not letting the government off the hook, but they also have to acknowledge that not every country is Germany, right? And like when I look at the United States, I mean, it's a deeply flawed system, right, to be polite, and very, very dysfunctional. And that's not theoretical. So you can say like, well, but we should hope for this to change, But then look at the real lives of people. This is real people living real lives every day, and they are getting all these promises, from politicians, and they just don't come through. It's not felt in their lives, and I think this has to change, right? And there's, I think, a significant feeling of a lack of voice, right? That you don't have a voice in society, right? Which also cooperatives are in response to, because when you think about in the United States, incarcerated people returning from prison, returning citizens entering the workplace, so they are excluded from federal elections, right? I don't know if you know this. So like when you come out of prison in the US, you cannot vote anymore. And those are the only workplaces where they, actually have a real voice, like they are equal members and have a voice. And I think that is, I think ultimately it's about social democracy. I think that's a social democracy where people really have a felt relationship to what's happening in the government, really changing their lives, and the government that also really represents the types of people that actually constitute the population, right? So that kind of stakeholder society, right? Like where people really feel part of that. I had talked about the vision before. You had asked before, and I pointed to a vision of a sort of pluralistic commonwealth, right? So where cooperatives are part of a global network of businesses that can also change the sort of north-south dynamic, right? This gap, which of course is a criticism of cooperatives today, which is like even the largest cooperatives like Mondragon are dependent on supply chains that are just as deeply exploitative as anyone else. And if there would also be cooperatives in the global south that then produce for cooperatives in the global north, right, and you would establish this commonwealth, you could change that. You could even extend that vision to what some people have called like data colonialism, right? And to push back against which I think affects people in the global south much more than people in the global north, because the data collection is much more ruthless. To actually put people in the global south in charge of their own data through data trusts or things we had mentioned earlier, and maybe push back on that in this way as well. So I think that's a vision. I think Paracon is a great approach as well. There are many, right, of the sort of post-work society and many others, which I support, but, I think they are often so far away that, and this is very important, I'm not at all taking away from that, but I think there is a lot of that, there's a lot of these long-term visions. There's very, very few of these sort of next steps, right? And I think like a lot of academics like really discourage this, right? They say like, well, this is just too pragmatic and you get stuck in this sort of presentism or whatever you want to call it. And I really disagree with that. And I think it's deeply disrespectful of the lives of people now, of the workers now that are living in these super precarious situations. So I think to build something, as you said, a nucleus of like a scaffolding, right? A scaffolding on which you can then erect like a post-capitalist vision, or let's say like a social democracy just on the way to that, is deeply valuable and something I really support.
And there's one question I ask all of my guests at the end, and this is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Well, I mean, maybe I can talk to you about a class I taught, which sounds maybe expected, but in 2020 in February, Mondragon, the largest worker corp in the world, right? So they came to visit me at the university. And shortly thereafter, the pandemic started, and we immediately, we signed a paper to collaborate, and we started a class, an online class on platform co-ops, like an emergency response. And we taught over 1,200 students from 57 countries, and managed, because there was this sense of urgency, to engage over 60 organizations actually in those countries. So they supported the course locally, helping people with their local knowledge about the laws and language, etc., to start those projects. And we had weekly meetings, everybody in their lockdown, and in a time which was really rather dark and possibly depressing. And for me, this was just, it was an incredible experience, because you saw all these people, like from, transgender entrepreneurs in Malaysia connecting with like African-American entrepreneurs in Selma, Alabama, right? Just to see these like in front of you, like all these people all over the world, right, having this wonderful spirit and all dedicating themselves to changing their world. I guess if anything could give you hope, that was definitely a moment and it really sowed the seeds for further work, right? Because now these organizations learned about platform co-ops, and they are now incubating them, right? Also after the class is over, and we still hear from projects coming out of that, and so on. So it's a very beautiful experience.
Great, Trebor. Thank you so much for taking the time and being part of Future Histories. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your great question.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.